of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism or Jew hatred was one of those dark, old-fashioned evils that modern humanity was leaving behind. Like slavery, or child labour, or public executions, it was part of our dark past. We were modern, and we were walking towards brightness. That was what I thought. Now, these latest Hanukkah murders happened on Bondi Beach in Australia, but today they could have happened almost anywhere. They could have happened in Sweden or Peru or Canada. They have happened in Manchester. We are living in a world where the hatred and murder of Jews is back. It's coming after Gaza from parts of the self-righteous left. It's coming with the return of white nationalism in America from the right as well. And if you think I'm exaggerating about that, let me quote you Nick Fuentes. He's an influential figure on the American right, recently given a platform by the even more influential Tucker Carlson. Here's what he said: "We are done with the Jewish oligarchy. We are done with the slavish surrender to Israel, the wars, the foreign aid, the policing of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, religion and propaganda." He equates Jews with Israel, Israel with all Jews. It's the kind of thing you might hear on the fringes of a Gaza march in London, or from an extremist with a megaphone anywhere in Europe. You see, the Bondi Beach story isn't really about gun control or community relations in Australia. It is part of a worldwide story today which takes us back to ancient prejudice. But of course, nothing is only global, everything is also local. So later on, you'll hear from the local Bondi Beach resident, the novelist Kathy Lette, who knows Ahmed al-Ahmed, who heroically wrestled the gun off one of the terrorists.
He's my local fruit shop guy from the Shire. That's where we buy our fruit. And there he was, the least likely hero in the world. And he just acted in the moment with such incredible courage.
Before we get to Kathy, I want to go to the bigger issue of the dark and infectious poison we call anti-Semitism. Anthony Julius is a lawyer who represented Princess Diana. He's also an eminent historian of anti-Semitism in British culture. I asked him about the argument that today's anti-Semitism is caused by the actions of the Israeli government in Gaza.
It's not an argument. It's a claim about causation, which doesn't really stand very much scrutiny. But it's not something one engages with as an argument. At the time of the Boer War, there were people who said, "Oh, that's all the fault of the Jews." And Jews were asked to explain why that wasn't the case. During the First World War, it was said, "Oh, the reason there's so much Jew hatred is because Jews are not pulling their weight and contributing in appropriate numbers to the war effort." And the Board of Deputies of British Jews then undertook an analysis, and they were able to prove that, in fact, the Jewish community was contributing a disproportionately high number of its members to the war effort. And they published a roll of honor in which they demonstrated the truth of that counter-assertion. And I think it's fair to say that it had absolutely no impact at all
on public opinion,
on the level of Jew hatred, because Jew hatred is a historical malice which attaches itself to any arguments or contentions in which Jews are involved in order to pursue its own hostile interests.
And so I suppose, in a sense, the argument, therefore, is why now? Or the question, therefore, is why now? Because if you look at the United States and America first, and Charles Lindbergh back in the 20s and 30s, there was an enormous, powerful anti-Semitic atmosphere on the American right. And it's suddenly come back again with Nick Fuentes and the parts of the MAGA movement right now. And it's a genuine puzzle. Why now?
But I think the more interesting question, if you'll allow me, is to ask why between 1945 and the 1990s there wasn't high, or at any rate visibly high, levels of Jew hatred, because taking that period as exceptional and recognizing Jew hatred as a appalling constant is historically a more precise way of thinking about the problem.
Is the answer to that question not simply the Holocaust and the early impact of the Holocaust on American society?
I think, yes, exactly. And not just on American society, in Europe as well.
So in a way, the danger is that we have passed that period around the West, and the West is returning to ancient tropes, ancient Jew hatred.
Of course, and it's not, therefore, for nothing that the way in which that passage from memory of the Holocaust to, so to speak, a dismissing of the Holocaust is marked by the appropriation of the language of the Holocaust to describe the war between Hamas and Israel. Because, of course, if Israel and the Jewish world generally are taken to be the equal of Nazi perpetrators, then we no longer need to feel collectively guilty. We non-Jews, we non-Jewish world need to feel collectively guilty anymore about the Holocaust, because here we have the new Nazis in our midst.
Which is why, presumably, you see extreme right-wing figures in America openly saying they admire Hitler.
Yes, of course. It's part of a kind of final ridding of the burden of the Holocaust by people who would otherwise wish to pursue their campaigns against Jews.
And so what do you think the impact of what happened in Gaza, where a huge number of people were killed in that war, has had on all of this?
I think that people who have a conspiratorial tendency to blame bad stuff on Jews will seize on occasions and conflicts in which it becomes plausible within their own understanding to make that claim.
And meanwhile, we have a rise in much more assertive, much angrier Islamism across the West, as well as in the Middle East. And at the same time, we have this revived idea of kind of Christian white nationalism in the United States. So in other words, the old confessional arguments coming back.
Yes, I mean, if they ever
went away.
I mean, what is secularism but the restating of religious language in ostensibly secular terms?
So when you pick up the papers or turn on the radio and hear about Bondi Beach and what happened there, what do you feel? Do you feel anger? Do you feel resignation? Do you feel despair?
Well, anger, of course, a deep distress and a fellow feeling with Jews there, as with the Jews in Manchester only a few weeks ago who were killed. And of course, these murders, these pogroms took place on Jewish festivals, one on Yom Kippur and one Hanukkah. Just at the inauguration of Hanukkah. It's a frontal attack on Jewish life and the way we Jews everywhere in the world live our religious lives.
Anthony.
And of course, one feels desperate for them. And it's perhaps not surprising that we also feel quite anxious about our own safety too.
Anthony, Julius, it's been a genuine privilege to have you on the show. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Well, people can kid themselves that one is a cause for the other, but really it's been perhaps a trigger for some people on their in particular interpretation. But, as Anthony Julius has just told us all, anti-Semitism has been around a long time, and this is just the latest manifestation. And it's the old hatred coming back again. It never really went away, but it's come back, and it's now come back in the form of people being actually murdered in our country and elsewhere.
Do you not think the sheer number of people killed in Gaza has something to do with this?
I think there may be people who kid themselves about that, but I've asked them, aren't they concerned about the murders committed by Hamas, the terrorism? And what's the hatred about? Why want to kill Jews on the streets of Britain? But of course, when we look at what happened and is still happening in the protest marches about Gaza, we do hear that scream of globalise the Intifada. So
and you see that as you see that as a profoundly anti-Semitic chant, globalise the Intifada, because it means globalise attacks on Jews. That's what you would think.
Yes, I do. I think it's an anti-Semitic chant, whether the people who call it understand that or they don't. And it has already led in this country to British Jews being killed in their places of worship, and killed gathering to pray in a festive occasion of Hanukkah in Australia. And many Jews in this country feeling very fearful, feeling extremely concerned as British citizens.
I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that, because, of course, we've mentioned the terrible events in Manchester already. But, you know, there are a lot of Jews in all the big British cities, Manchester and also London, going around with kippahs on their head, going around in Jewish garb of one kind or another. What do you think the atmosphere in the community is now, particularly after something like Bondi Beach reminding everyone?
Well, the atmosphere in the British Jewish community, and I've spoken to many people over the last few days, is of deep concern, distress, and a bit of fear, but also some anger about why this isn't being addressed more forcibly here in this country. And when even yesterday, I understand there was a big march in Birmingham with similar cries about globalising the Intifada being called on the streets as murders are taking place, I think that British citizens, and that includes British Jews, are entitled to ask, why is this going on? Why is something not being done to stop it? And something not being done to address the hate that is coming? You know, it's not all just happening in this country. Some of those hateful messages and teaching about hatred and killing is coming quite clearly from Iran. Some of it's propagated in mosques, and some of it is propagated elsewhere. And there is a tie-up that there's been for some time between elements of the far left and Islamist groups. Now, why aren't these things being addressed more forcibly? They're not new, but they're having the impact of people dying on the streets.
I mean, you left the Labour Party for these reasons during the Jeremy Corbyn years, but I think it's fair to say that Keir Starmer and, frankly, every other mainstream British leader has been speaking out against this. So what you're really saying is you want to hear the same kind of forthright condemnation of Jew hatred by imams and by leaders of the more kind of pro-Gaza movement that are appearing on the streets. In other words, it's those people are the ones who need to speak out.
Yes, I mean, Keir Starmer has transformed the Labour Party, and that's the reason I returned to the Labour Party. I left because of anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn. The party became a racist party. I returned when Keir Starmer changed it, but a lot more needs to be done now. Yes, it needs to be done by people in charge of the government as well, our authorities, but it also needs other people to speak out against extremism. But it does need action to be taken, and the government do have to do more.
Louise Ellmann, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, up next, as healthcare officials warn of a super flu pandemic this year, the BMA has voted to strike during Christmas. More on that next, but the time now, 6:16. Resident doctors have voted for a 5-day strike just before Christmas. Lord Robert Winston, the IVF pioneer, who takes the Labour whip in the House of Lords, joined me earlier on. What was his reaction to the new strikes?
I'm deeply unhappy about it. I'm very, very concerned. I'm concerned for the NHS. I'm concerned for the patients. And actually, in a sense, I'm also concerned for the doctors, because I think they're hugely misled, and I don't believe that they understand really what they're doing. We might want to talk about that.
Well, clearly they're still holding out for a pay offer, which the Secretary of State regards as completely impossible, impractical, and a fantasy.
Well, I think the Secretary of State's been as gentle as he could be with them. I mean, I think really what they are creating, indeed, is the risk of human life. There's no question about that.
You think people will die as a result of this?
I think people will die of it, and it's interesting to consider that after all, the British Medical Association has actually manipulated this situation. Clearly it has. It's encouraged the doctors to strike, in my view. And whether they like it or not, the fact is that it also has a very large ethics committee, which is largely praised, often heard of. It's not that good, but it's a big ethics committee.
And well known around the place.
And well known in the country. And yet here they are, showing no ethical judgment within the British Medical Association itself, which is quite shocking.
Do you think the BMA's ethics committee should look at the ethics of calling this strike?
Yes, of course I do.
And what do you think they would conclude?
Do you know, I've no idea, but if they've got any sense, they would say, actually, it's not ethical, because clearly it can't be.
Mm-hmm. What does the strike do to other doctors, more senior doctors, but also to the nurses and the rest of the staff of the NHS?
With nursing, of course, it puts it under massive strain. And with senior doctors, I think the consultants have been doing a hard job, very difficult. I mean, there aren't enough consultants anyway. But one of the issues here is the issue of the things that have been offered to the doctors. They've been offered, for example, special training posts, and so that, in fact, there'll be there will be two for every one post. When I was a junior doctor, when I applied for a job, I'd be one of 6 applying. That was standard. The competition to become a trainee was much, much harder. The government have offered to make that very much easier. It's really why I got my career that I did, because eventually, in fact, I've got through that net. But the fact of the matter is that they don't seem to understand that this is really an important step, and we will end up making specialists who really will not have particular specialist abilities.
Do you think there is a wider problem in that the NHS has relied so heavily for so long on foreign-trained doctors, and a lot of people who would love to be a doctor in the NHS, in the UK, have been unable to get a place at medical school?
Well, I think West Reading is trying to address that issue, and in fact there are some new medical schools coming up. For example, the one in Cumbria, which is associated with Imperial College, which is taking local students who previously probably wouldn't have got into a medical school, but are really excellent students, and they're in their first year now.
But this is something as a country we need to do.
We need to be doing that. I'd say one thing more, and that is actually it does underpin something much more important, which is the question of actually the whole health service. It's really about time we really need to look at the health service and decide what's actually going to be done about it. Because at the moment we can't continue indefinitely with the underfunding, and that, of course, is part of the problem which is causing this issue now as far as the youngest doctors are concerned.
Coming back to funding involves inevitably at some stage a discussion of a specific tax or impost only for the NHS. That's where it tends to come back to. Is that something you would like to see?
I think I'd like to see a proper discussion, and I'd like us really to be really honest and look at what's really happening in other countries and see really what they do well and what they don't do so well. It's not all that good in some countries, that system within Europe, but in other places it's obviously very successful. And I think it really does need somebody to look at. But of course, when you make it a political football, and when you are, as I am, a member of the Labour Party, you're very reluctant to suggest that it shouldn't be free at the point of entry. And that, I think, is a very difficult issue. But we should stop using it as a political football.
Can I ask you about what seemed to me to be the political dangers of this strike, which is we've seen in terms of polling falling public support for resident doctors as these strikes have gone on. They are no longer nearly as popular as they used to be, and that then eventually translates into less support for the NHS itself. In other words, do you think the case for the NHS is undermined by this kind of action?
I think the case for the NHS is somewhat undermined, but I think it might work out that we will rely much more on nurses and nursing staff and improve their expertise. So in the long term, I think the doctors will really lose out, and I think their training will be heavily suffering as a result. I think the implications of this go far beyond what has been reported in the press, and I do hope that somebody comes to their senses and recognises this is not something you should do at any time, least of all at Christmas when there is a flu epidemic going on.
Let me end this conversation by asking you to address directly a resident doctor who has perhaps voted for the strike and is looking in the mirror today, wondering what to do at 7:30 a.m. on Wednesday, whether to go into the strike or not. What would you say to them?
I would say that when I was a resident doctor, it was standard in the firm system that each of us who admitted a patient to hospital was responsible for that patient's care. We were the first port of call. That was the junior hospital's doctor. And even when we were off duty, we still actually took the phone calls to make certain that the team on the site understood what we had planned for that patient. We're losing that completely in the health service. And I think I have to say to the resident doctors, they have to understand that really they have huge influence and huge power over that patient in front of them. That patient is vulnerable. That patient is in pain, possibly. That patient is nervous. They're worried they've got something much worse than they really think they have. And actually that is made worse by the lack of care that they're going to get, or the perception of lack of care, or the disorganization of the care which occurs. So that is a very serious issue. When you disorganize medical treatment in this way, you are undoubtedly increasing the death rate, and you are likely to result in far more diseases not being properly treated.
So get up, get dressed, and go to work.
Go to work.
Lord Winston, thank you very much. The Hong Kong free speech campaigner Jimmy Lai has been convicted on national security charges. Aged 78, he faces spending the rest of his life in prison. His son Sebastian's been campaigning passionately for his release, and he's here with me now, where we have been watching the Foreign Secretary, Sebastien, start to talk to the Commons about this very case. Let me ask you, first of all, about your father's health. As I say, 78, he's not a well man.
No, unfortunately not, and his health is rapidly deteriorating. In the last 5 years, he's been kept in solitary confinement the whole time. 14 days is prolonged solitary confinement. He's been there for 1,800 days.
Gosh.
And so this is just the mental aspect of it, but the physical aspect is a 78-year-old man who, during the summers, has all these heat rashes. And so he's bleeding everywhere, which leads to his muscles being affected. And
it's stifling heat in this prison.
Oh, he has his window blocked off. So he is in this little concrete cell by himself. And Hong Kong goes up to 33 degrees routinely, so more than 50 times a year.
It's a kind of torture.
It is torture. It is torture, and that has led to his heart having issues, his nails falling off, his teeth rotting, and rapid weight loss. In the last year alone, he's lost 10 kilos.
And he's been convicted of conspiracy charges. I'm not sure it's not the full treason charges. So his life isn't threatened directly, but he could be in prison for the rest of his life.
Yeah, and in fact, even if he gets 5 years, that's in those conditions, it's practically the same as a death sentence.
The Foreign Secretary is talking in the Commons right now about this, but presumably you think the British government could do still more? I mean, I do know they raised the case.
Yeah, and we're so incredibly grateful, and I just want to thank the Foreign Secretary personally for I haven't seen the full statement, but it seems to be an incredibly strong statement. Yes, it's about putting words to action. Look, so many countries on our side saying that my father should be released immediately. But is how do we get to the next step where he is free and back home in the UK with his family? And in order to do that, I think if we're talking about closer relationships with China, my father's release needs to be a precondition to that.
Absolutely. We're talking rightly about your father, but this is also from the point of view of the Chinese government trying to intimidate free speech and democracy campaigners across China, but particularly in Hong Kong. What is the condition of the campaign for democracy in Hong Kong now?
I think free speech, free press, not just democracy, any criticism that the government doesn't like has essentially been curtailed.
So to put it really brutally, the repression, the suppression of free speech is working.
Yeah, as they say, the loudest sound of suppression is silence. But that's on everything. And in doing so, they have essentially destroyed the fabric of Hong Kong. What made Hong Kong great was that you had a place, an international financial center, where you knew that there was a rule of law, where if you saw that there was a problem, you could speak out, and where if speaking out wasn't loud enough, you could go to the press, and the press will print it out. That mechanism is completely destroyed.
Silence across Hong Kong. Now, I'm pretty sure you want to get into the House of Commons and listen more to what the Foreign Secretary is saying, Sebastien, but thank you very, very much indeed for coming in and talking to LBC. We've had you on before, we'll have you on again, I'm sure. Meanwhile, President Trump has launched an astonishing attack against the film director Rob Reiner, famous for films such as Princess Bride and When Harry Met Sally. He was found stabbed to death in his Los Angeles home alongside his wife. Our Washington correspondent, Simon Marks, is here to give us the details. An extraordinary outburst from President Trump, even by his standards, Simon.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, Andrew. I mean, even by the very low standards that exist for this president, this is simply jaw-dropping. I mean, in many ways, I think the most shameful moment of his time in office. Remember that Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were found stabbed to death in their Brentwood mansion in Los Angeles on Sunday night. Within the last few hours, we have learnt that their 32-year-old son is in custody on on $4 million bail, possibly connected to the deaths of his parents. And as Hollywood has reeled from this news, we've seen tearful images of actors including Billy Crystal and Larry David showing up at the family home to assist police in their investigations. As liberal America has reeled, because Rob Reiner was very well known for his support of progressive causes, Donald Trump has literally taken to social media to dance on their graves. He says in an inflammatory posting on his Truth Social account, "A very sad thing happened last night in Hollywood. Rob Reiner, a tortured and struggling but once very talented movie director and comedy star, has passed away together with his wife Michelle, reportedly due to the anger he caused others through his massive, unyielding and incurable affliction with a mind-crippling disease known as Trump derangement syndrome." And this message continues with Donald Trump saying that Rob Reiner was known to have driven people crazy by his raging obsession with Donald J. Trump and his obvious paranoia, reaching new heights as the Trump administration surpassed all goals and ushered in a new golden age into America. It is simply disgraceful. A president of the United States who, just in September, railed against people on the left whom he accused of taking to social media to celebrate the assassination of one of his friends and close supporters, Charlie Kirk, on this occasion, quite literally attempting to make sardonic fun at the hands of Rob Reiner and his wife. And by the way, his wife, in an earlier era, back in 1987, as a photographer in New York, she took the image of Donald Trump that appears on the cover of The Art of the Deal, which only makes this even more disgraceful.
A president for whom everything has to be about him. An extraordinary story. Simon, thank you so much for that. Now, coming up, as the Prime Minister travels to Berlin for further Ukraine talks, are territorial concessions really still on the cards? Time now, 6:32, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
Night with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:34. It's been a busy old day for the Prime Minister. He went directly from being interrogated by MPs to Berlin, where he'll meet Ukraine's President Zelensky, US officials and European leaders to discuss the obvious. Let's talk now to Donald Trump's former National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador, great to have you back on the show. All the European leaders are gathering in Berlin, but in your view, is President Putin still really in charge?
Well, it looks to me that the direction of travel is entirely favorable to Russia at this point. The last report about these negotiations that we have over here is that Zelensky has said that the United States will give security guarantees equivalent to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Number one, I doubt that. I don't know what Witkoff and Kushner may have said to Zelensky, but I personally doubt that they're ever going to see language to that effect, number one. And number two, why should Zelensky or anybody else think that Donald Trump will give more credence to that kind of security guarantee than he's given to Article 5 of the NATO treaty to begin with? I think this is very troubling. Look, what Putin wants to do is recreate the Russian Empire. And he may have to pause to absorb Ukraine. He's prepared to do that. I think it would benefit Russia to have a couple or 3 years to rebuild their army. Nobody should be under any illusions that he's giving up the aspiration to take the entire country. So to say that words on a piece of paper, which apparently will not include U.S. troops actually stationed in Ukraine for this following period, that's going to be adequate for Ukraine's security. I think they're taking a leap in the dark if that really is the direction they're moving.
Meanwhile, apparently President Zelensky has said that he will give up NATO aspirations, which is a big moment, but there are still territorial issues between the two countries, and it seems to me to be very, very hard to see how they can ever be reconciled. Giving up the Donbass is not something that Zelensky could do and stay in power himself.
I think politically in Ukraine, that's correct. But from Trump's perspective, it comes back to the point you made at the end of your last segment. This is always about Donald Trump. He doesn't have any red lines on what this peace deal should look like. He couldn't care less what the substance is. What he wants is an agreement that he can trumpet as part of his application for the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be able to say, like these other 7 or 8 wars that he says in his national security statement he's resolved in the past year, now he's resolved this conflict. And there's no evidence that Vladimir Putin's influence over Trump to persuade him that he's actually the party most in need here has changed a bit. I think this process of negotiating with ourselves, Europeans and Zelensky and the U.S., is something that in the days of the Soviet Union, they tried desperately to do, have the West give up its position internally before they come to us. Then we reject it and force them to go back and make more concessions. I have a very bad feeling about the way this is moving.
Yeah, I think you're right. Now, Ambassador, with respect, you are not a psychiatrist and I am not a psychiatrist. But I know you were listening to our earlier segment about that absolutely extraordinary social media post from Donald Trump about Rob Reiner and his wife being murdered. I just wondered what your reaction was to it.
Well, it's so inappropriate and so beyond the bounds that it's hard to say anything about it, except who but Donald Trump would even think of writing a tweet like that. And, I've hoped for a long time, since in 2015 or 2016, Donald Trump said he didn't like John McCain. He wanted heroes who didn't become prisoners of war. And I thought at that moment, well, that's the end of his campaign for the presidency, that something would get enough attention to his supporters that they'd say, he really isn't qualified to be president. This is one more. I don't know how many straws on the camel's back it's going to take, but it's just unpresidential behavior at an absolute minimum.
Your country is a well-educated, grown-up, serious country, and you wonder whether this kind of thing is going to actually have an effect on Donald Trump's MAGA base. They look at it, they think that's one stage too far for me.
Well, I think we've passed peak Trump here. I think if you look at what's happened in Washington in the past, I'll say 30 to 45 days, I think people now recognize he's not a new president. He's a lame duck president, and we're on the downhill slope. Now, I'm not predicting the rate of descent or how far he'll go, but each day that passes brings us closer to the 26 elections, which many Republicans in Washington, forced to defend Trump's policies, are going to find a lot of unemployed members of Congress after that's over. And then I think things really do go downhill for him. So it's 3 years of Trump in office may seem like a long time, but people need to prepare for the end of Trump and not make conclusions that the U.S. is going to be like this forever. Not going to happen.
That's a very good perspective, very interesting perspective. Still on the subject of perspective, if I may, can I read you something that Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, has said? You'll remember that Donald Trump called Sadiq Khan a horrible, vicious, disgusting mayor. Khan has said, "I'm slightly curious and concerned why the leader of the free world, who's got so many challenges in the Middle East, in Ukraine, issues around climate, issues around trade, is spending time talking about me and giving the impression he's obsessed with me, and for him, it's to explain why." What do you think the reason might be?
Well, there's a contradiction in the president's national security strategy that's reflected in his comments about Sadiq Khan. They say at one point, we reject all this neoconservative stuff about democracy and so on in foreign countries, and at the same time spend a good part of that statement criticizing failures in democracy in European countries, including the UK. So they criticize Europe, but fail to criticize Russia and China. And I think it's just Trump is imposing his views of various issues and his views of himself on other people, because really, what's more important than Donald Trump's opinion? I can't think of anything that's more important. He certainly can't.
He certainly can't. Ambassador Bolton, thank you very much for talking to LBC tonight. Now then, as we tiptoe towards the end of the year and we look backwards, it's obviously been a year dominated by Donald Trump. No country has felt this more acutely, I think, than Canada, whose outspoken High Commissioner, Ralph Goodale, heads home shortly. he reflected with me on what has been a roller coaster ride. It's a year since Trump threatened to make his country, a Commonwealth country, the 51st state.
Well, it's been a very disturbing year. Canadians are obviously very preoccupied with that topic and very unhappy about that topic. But I think the resolve has been there, rock solid through the year, that we will defend our sovereignty. We'll be smart about it and do it in a way that's as effective as it can possibly be. But Canadians are very determined to stay Canadian.
And how important has the role of the new Prime Minister, our former Governor of the Bank of England, been when he was talking about elbows up, which I understand is an ice hockey phrase meaning aggression towards the enemy?
He has been very well received by Canadians. I think his stint, first of all, as the governor of the Bank of Canada for 7 years, and then almost immediately after that, governor of the Bank of England for another 7 years. I think that has developed for Mr. Carney a very solid reputation as someone who is a good administrator, who knows economics, who can deal with the realities of a troubled world. I'm not sure if Canadians fully appreciate all of the details of the current relationship between Canada and the United States, as troubled and as fraught as it is, but they know it's in trouble, and I think they have a good deal of confidence that Mark Carney is a man who can handle that, and he has been demonstrating that in the steps that he has taken to build out the economy, eliminate internal trade barriers within Canada, speed up big projects in the resource, infrastructure, and export areas. Yeah. He's I think effectively selling a message to Canadians that we've got big trouble with our American neighbors. What we've known and experienced for the last 80 years is now over. We have to build a new relationship where we will be required to stand independently more on our own 2 feet, to be less reliant and less vulnerable. And as difficult as that is, I think Canadians want to succeed at that mission.
Well, of course, this is a message which sounds very familiar to people here in the UK as well. And it's partly about personal relationships. So just talk us through the importance of that moment when Mark Carney went to the White House and discovered, as other people have done before, that Donald Trump growls from a distance and then purrs close up.
Well, he's been in those encounters at least twice in front of the television cameras and several other times when the two have communicated privately in other circumstances. It's I'm sure unsettling to sit across from the leader of a country that has been your best friend, your closest ally, your supporter, your military provider in many ways. And then suddenly find that the friendship, the warmth, the reliability, the trust is not there anymore as it used to be. It's like a really cold shower and unsettling for Canadians. But I think at the same time, there is a very steely resolve among Canadians. Yeah. Okay. If that's the game we're going to play, if those are the facts and that's what we've got to deal with, then all right, elbows up. We won't be deliberately offensive or provocative, but we will defend ourselves and we will try to build for ourselves an economy and a defense and security system that will be stronger and better than any foreign power could ever take away from us. One of the corollaries of that, Andrew, is that we need closer and better and tighter relationships with old, reliable friends, partners, and allies like the United Kingdom. And Carney is working on that too.
Which takes us to our shared king. And I'm interested in your views. He made, of course, a remarkable speech to the Canadian House of Commons, and he has been pretty outspoken in his views on this subject. How important has he been in this story?
I think very important. It's a basic civics lesson for a lot of people. How does a constitutional monarchy work when the king lives in another country? How to explain that rather peculiar arrangement? And I think it was very important for His Majesty to make it abundantly clear that he is the King of Canada. He is the head of our democratic constitutional monarchy, and he stands unequivocally for the sovereignty of Canada. That weekend, when His Majesty was in Canada back in May, he was there for less than 24 hours. But as it turns out, the weather turned. We had a pretty lousy spring in Ottawa, but the weather turned. It was a beautiful, sunny, warm weekend. The crowds were big and warm. The Queen and the King seemed to be enjoying themselves. They had that critical constitutional function to perform, delivering what we call the speech from the throne. You call it the King's speech. We call it the speech from the throne, that opens a new session of Parliament following the election of a new government. And the message was absolutely clear and unequivocal. It was diplomatic and polite, but he made it abundantly clear that the true North, strong and free, is not for sale. And with all those years of protocol and diplomatic training that His Majesty has had, he sure knows how to deliver a punchline.
One final point. In the year ahead, the Mexico-United States-Canada trade agreement has to be agreed or not. A very, very big moment for Canada and the United States. What's your instinct about what's going to happen with that?
Well, who knows? It's going to be an important set of negotiations. We are confident that we can make the point abundantly clear that it's not only in our best interests, but it's also in the best interests of the United States to maintain this relationship in a strong and functional and cordial way.
High Commissioner, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. All the very best.
A fine man there. The new head of MI6 has given a warning in her first speech to the British public that the shadow war against Russia must be stepped up. But who is the woman now in charge of protecting us from the dark forces abroad? We'll find out next, with the time now 6:49.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale. Britain's Conversation, LBC, tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:51. Let's return to our top story today, that horrific attack against the Jewish community in Bondi Beach in Australia. A little earlier on, I spoke with the British-Australian author Kathy Lette, who was born and grew up in Bondi. She told me of her pride in the diversity of her home country.
Well, first of all, to just explain about our multicultural society, we are the most multicultural nation in the world. We are a human minestrone. 1 in 3 Australians was born overseas, which is an incredibly high percentage. And our new immigrants assimilate very quickly because the lifestyle's so seductive. It's so laid back, it's so easy, it's all that fun in the sun. So we've always prided ourselves on being a cohesive society, and this kind of division, sun worship was our main religion. There was never any religious strife in my whole lifetime growing up in Australia. So Bondi was the main centre for our Jewish community. And it's interesting how that happened, because the eastern suburbs of Sydney are now the most salubrious and desirable part of Sydney. But during the war, when the Japanese were coming into the harbour in their mini subs, most Australians were like, "Oh, I don't want to live near the harbour. I don't want to live near the ocean." And they went to the northern suburbs and went a bit west. But of course, this is the most prime real estate in Australia. Yeah. And our Jewish immigrants arrived and said, "Well, we think we'll live there," and they were so right. And of course, it was the center of our artistic community. All my friends growing up there, that's where the Jewish artists and writers and musicians and sculptors, that's where they lived. And of course, they welcomed me with open arms. And I always say I spent so much time in the Jewish community when I was a young woman that I started to sort of become Jewish. I became so Jewish, I felt guilty that I'm not, kind of thing. So, yes, that is the heart of our Jewish community. But as it's such a multicultural place, we just didn't feel those great divides until now.
So given everything that you've said, Kathy, how did you feel when you heard the news?
Well, Sunday morning was just shattering to open the papers, put the television on and see my beloved homeland, the centre of our Aussie psyche, there'd been this horrendous, atrocious attack there. And of course, all my British friends rang me straight away saying, oh, no, not Bondi. I mean, the sad thing is, Andrew, over the last decade, we've got so used to terrorism and hate and being afraid and war. But, Bondi seemed like an oasis of sanity and safety and fun and frivolity and freedom. So, my English friends were sobbing down the phone saying they couldn't believe that the tentacles of hate, religious hate, had stretched all the way even to Bondi. And, I had a lot of friends who were caught up in the attack. I had friends who were lying under cars in the car park, hiding. Another girlfriend of mine was out surfing, and British backpackers who were swimming swam out to her surfboard to hang on because they were too scared to go into shore. So, I mean, it's touched everyone I know in Sydney has either had a friend or they knew someone who was killed, or they had a friend who was there, because, it is our playground.
Yes. I know we don't want to get into the politics of this, Kathy, but it does make you reflect that when it comes to anti-Semitism, there are no safe spaces.
No. There are no safe spaces. I'll tell you what was good, Andrew. I was so worried about reprisals and this stirring up hatred in our community. But that courageous man who tackled the gunman was of Syrian background, so I presume a Muslim. So that has done a lot to heal divisions. I'm telling you, that was amazing. He's my local fruit shop guy from the Shire. That's where we buy our fruit. And there he was, the least likely hero in the world. And he just acted in the moment with such incredible courage. So that's done a lot to cool tempers. And Australians, we are very cohesive. We have a wonderful attitude, positive attitude to life. So, I think what we're saying to everyone is let's draw together. Let's not let these terrorists divide us with their hate and their bitterness and their viciousness. Let's continue to be the free, happy, cohesive, multicultural society which we cherish and adore.
Right, it's up to you. The export of chaos is a feature, not a bug in the Russian approach to international engagement, says Blaise Metrueli, the new MI6 boss. She's not a woman you would want to cross. Let's talk now to Nigel Inkster, the former deputy head of MI6. Nigel, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Just tell us a little bit about Blaise, who seems almost a fictional character. She's almost too good to be true.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, she is very talented. There's no question about it. She started her career as a case officer, and I think this is something very important in terms of her taking over the top job, because the people working for her know that she's been there, she's done the business, she understands how to recruit and run agents in difficult circumstances, but she's also very modern-minded. And her focus on technology, I think, epitomizes that. The reality nowadays, I mean, intelligence work has always required agencies to be on the forefront of technology. But the technologies are evolving so rapidly now that is becoming more and more of a challenge. And Blaise, I think, is acknowledging that in what she's been saying.
She's a proper spook, in other words. Let me ask you a little bit about, she's got this extraordinary family background as well. I think her grandfather, who she never knew, fought in the Red Army, then defected to the Germans and did terrible things in the war, and then vanished in 1943.
Yes, well, that story, I don't know how much of that is real and how much is the product of the febrile imaginations of the Russian intelligence agencies. but that was a particularly difficult time, and people's loyalties and commitments were very different then. But yes, it is a very intriguing background.
And the other intriguing thing, of course, is that she was Q. She was in charge of the Aston Martins and the exploding pens. Is there really such a department? I'm exaggerating slightly, but in reality.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. And as I said just now, the fact is that intelligence agencies have always relied upon technologies to do what they need to do, in particularly developing capabilities to communicate securely with agents in the field. And, back in my time, certainly up until the end of the Cold War, that those technologies were very much within the domain of government. We had black boxes, espionage for the use of. They were bulky, complicated to use, and very compromising if you were found with them. Nowadays, it's the private sector, it's the tech bros in California that are driving this.
It's a new world.
It's a new world, and it's about modifying these technologies for the work that the intelligence agencies need to do.
Nigel, I now know who I really need to interview next year early on. Thank you very much indeed for telling me all about Blaise. Now, I'm going to be back with you tomorrow when we'll have an exclusive interview with the head of the British Armed Forces himself, Sir Richard Knighton. Coming up at 10 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. These incidents are chillingly